Good evening. I think we're going to get started. Glad you all could come out tonight. The topic we're going to be discussing is why study the humanities. And a little bit of background. This is Dr. Owen Anderson. He is a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University West. He's a full professor now, which I think is pretty awesome. Owen and I went to school together here at PVCC. At the same time, we kind of had a parallel career path. And so he's here tonight as a PVCC alumni to give his talk. And so this is part of our PVCC public lecture series, public philosophy series, and we do want to have alumni come back and talk about their experience as professors, particularly philosophy professors. I also want to acknowledge some people that are here. Dr. Surendra Gangadine is here, and he's Professor Emeritus. He was our teacher. We have Dr. Peter Redpath here, who is a retired philosopher in the area. And I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Cristiano and Dr. Ruby for coming out. They are in the Communications and Humanities department here, and the current chair of the division and the upcoming chair of the division. So thank you for coming out. I want to let you know that we have some other talks coming up, and the big one is going to be next Tuesday. I'm going to make this bigger for you to look at. This is God and Truth 6. This is a tradition that they have at Glendale Community College. Every year they have this talk. And this topic for this talk is religion or secular humanism. That is the question. So can the religious people or the secular people show how there's meaning in the world? And the speakers include Dr. Anderson and myself and two other local philosophy professors, Dr. Michael Valley and Peter Lupu, who's a professor at GCC, and then Richard Klaus is a member of the community. So I invite you to come out to that talk. It is next Tuesday at 1 o'clock at Glendale Community College. They're expecting a big crowd, like 300 people. It's going to be a throwdown. Is it? Am I right? Is it going to be a throwdown? All right.
We had it last year with about 300.
Yeah. It's going to be a throwdown. Another talk I want to invite you to is the third in our series. It's November 13th at 6 o'clock. Professor Greg Goodrich, who's at Gateway Community College, he's also an alumni from PVCC, is going to be talking about science, religion, and Jordan Peterson. And then the last in our series for the semester, I don't have a flyer yet, but as soon as I do, it will be up here on this website, is Dr. Redpath's talk, Can a Christian Philosophy Exist? If yes, what is its nature? So one more thing, I just want to say thank you to Ellen and Cecile in the back here who have been helping us out. If you are a PVCC student or alumni, check with them and get on our mailing list. And also they helped us out with providing snacks. So if you need some snacks, they're in the back. And now I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Anderson to take over, and he has provided an outline of his talk. So, Dr. Anderson?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Make sure this is that on? Can you hear me okay? Yes. It's nice to see some students from ASU and some students who are from PVCC. I'm glad to see you here. And others I know, past students and colleagues. So thank you for being here tonight. And as Dr. Burton said, I'm a former student. I came to PVCC as a freshman, and I wanted to study philosophy. And philosophy is one of the subjects of the humanities. So you can ask, we'll be asking myself that question. Why study the humanities? And there's some questions I had on my mind back then, which will factor into what we'll be talking about tonight. Now, I'd like this to be somewhat conversational. So I do have points I want to go over, but I may ask some questions during it. I don't want you to be hesitant to answer those questions and give some ideas. We can discuss them and go over them. That's more engaging than just being talked at for a while, right? Yeah, it is. Trust me. You can trust me. It is. Now, let me see. I should probably make this a little larger, right? How do we do that on this?
See up there where it says 100%? Top left.
Yeah, there we go. Is that good? Can you read that? Okay. So some questions here we have to go through. Why study the humanities? And how do we take that question? If you're going to college, you're going to end up taking a humanities class, even if you're not a major, because of something that's very nice that I call job security, and that's called general ed requirements. So you might be going into college to study something useful, right? Like nursing or law or health, and they'll still ask you to take a humanities class. Because otherwise, what we do with all of us philosophers, you don't want us roaming the streets out of work. You got to have some place for us to go during the day, right? So why study the humanities? What kind of question is that? That's the first point. It could be a kind of practical question, which is answered by answering why do we have general ed requirements? But that doesn't probably satisfy us, because we can ask why have those requirements at all? So this is a kind of question about the nature of the humanities. It's not just a practical question. I mean, think about how, I don't know if you've been to an advisor to look at your degree requirements, and if you can kind of remember that layout and cut out the humanities classes, how much quicker you'd be done. Wouldn't that be nice? Finish up more quickly. Or you might say, no, I'm taking a humanities degree. I'm a major in one of the humanities fields. And then you can't cut them out, and so then part of the question will be, why? Don't you have better things to do with your time and money? And that's part of what we'll try to figure out tonight. Now, this question so it's not just a practical question, and we can put it into its parts. We can ask this: why study at all? I don't know if you were ever like me in K through 12, but I would kind of count the years until I was done, up to 12th grade, right? And then someone told me, no, there's still college. I say, what, there's more after that? I was so close. And it's sort of like, yeah, why have to study? Why can't we get on with the business of doing things? And that's sort of like asking why think about things. Because that's what you're doing when you're studying, right? You're thinking about things. And so I'm wondering if we've been taking this as a practical question largely because we're thinking mostly about studying as practical. I study to get certain kinds of skills in place I can then go on to get paid for. And we can't reduce thinking to just that. We'll have to think about thinking a little differently. For example, what do you want to think about? What will you think about in the humanities? Do you think much? Do you think at all? In a Gilbert and Sullivan play, the Admiral of the Navy brags that he never thinks for himself, he hardly thinks at all. So what do we want to think about? I'm going to mention this because the student's not here, but I told my classes, hey, you should come to my talk tonight. And a student said, what time is it? And do you remember what he was going to be doing? He couldn't make it because there was a Fortnite competition, a video game competition right now. So, I wish I could go, but there's Fortnite competition at the same time. So it's not so much a question of thinking, but what will he be thinking about? How will he be spending his time? Are all things equally valuable to think about? Do you ever find yourself wasting your time thinking about things that you sort of look back on and you say, oh, that wasn't a good use of my time, my thought? So you might intuitively recognize not all things are equally valuable to think about. So this immediately then brings up the idea of value and thought, and some things are more valuable to think about than others. And is there a most valuable thing to think about? This was something that I was asked on my first day here in Philosophy 105. Have any of you had Philosophy 105 yet? Introduction to Ethics? Yeah, you might know what question. Do you remember what kinds of questions they asked on the first day? Oh, yes. Say it louder.
What's the good?
Yes, what is the good? In ethics class, what is the highest value? Have you been asked that? Yeah, in ethics class? 105, right. What is the highest value? Would you like to think about that? Are there other things to think about that are more important than the highest value? Or by definition, is that the highest value? So that seems to be a good thing to be asked on your first day of college, doesn't it? What is the good? And what if you don't know? Or what if you go to other classes very excited about having been asked that question, and you find out the instructors in the other classes don't know? Will that make you feel let down? That's what I ended up doing. How I got a bad reputation. Taylor Swift and I have a bad reputation. Because I would ask at conferences, other professors, do you know what is good? Isn't that how she got her bad reputation? That she sings about that? What is the highest value? What is the good? So I'm going to connect up the humanities and this question as we're going. So this is point one, why study? And I think we often consider this in a very practical way. I don't blame you, especially when you're thinking about college and there's a lot of money involved. Can college be expensive? I'm not going to tell you how much credits were way back when I went to community college. I'm old enough now I can talk about way back then credits, because they actually were pretty cheap. So how will you spend your money? How about this? Let's say you avoid going to college altogether, but you still have to pay taxes. Are you able to get out of taxes? You haven't found a way yet? And some of your taxes go towards supporting state education, including the humanities. But why are they doing that? Don't they already provide people with libraries? And can't you go to the library and read the great books? Why would you also need state-funded humanities classes? You might think, hey, Anderson, what are you talking about? You're the one who gets paid to do this stuff. I know, we're going to work through some arguments, right? Some counter-arguments that people throw out there about whether or not we need state funding for humanities. Do you want to spend $50,000 to be taught a humanities education? And I brought up taxes because you might say, I'm not going to spend it, someone else will pay for it. Well, they might object and say, I don't want to spend $50,000, so we're going to have to see, it will come down to what's in the humanities education. So this is part of the first one here, this practical question, why study humanities? And other degrees don't get this kind of question. No one really ever asks, why study nursing? Do they? I was just in a Senate meeting yesterday at ASU, and we're talking about the decline of education majors at ASU. And the ones who do come apparently get the degree, and many of them move to other states. But no one ever asked that about education, right? Why study education? Why study nursing? Nothing wrong with those degrees. Those are wonderful degrees. It's just that you wouldn't have the same kind of talk usually. Why study engineering? Why study accounting? So there's a certain way in which this question comes up uniquely for the humanities. So one thing we need to do is figure out, what are the humanities? Sometimes I'll tell my students, I'm a humanist. And they'll say, I knew it. He's a philosopher. He's an atheist. No, humanist is not the same as a secular humanist. But if you study the humanities, you're a humanist. I have that question posed to me quite often. Professor Anderson, as an atheist, as a philosopher who teaches, you must be an atheist, and then it'll follow in. That's not the question, that's just the lead into the question. Since you're a philosopher, you must be an atheist, and therefore, so humanist doesn't necessarily mean a secular humanist. And when you study the humanities, you're studying what? Do you know? I ask my students that even in philosophy class, what are you going to study in here? How do they contrast with the sciences? I get the sense that if you go in to study, say, nursing or education or accounting, you kind of know what you're studying, right? You'll know what you'll be able to do at the end of the day. What about with the humanities? So we'll contrast these with the sciences or other technical degrees. Maybe some of these I'm speaking of are more like applied sciences. So in the humanities, the humanities, right? We're studying humans. You get to be under the microscope. You're the amoeba. Would you like to be studied? No. Now you might say in one way, isn't that true in nursing or medicine or some of the other degrees? So we have to narrow it down more than that. What about the human? And especially the study of human nature and all of its many aspects and relations. All of the things humans do. So that when you do a humanities degree, you can think about the different disciplines listed underneath a humanities degree, right? There'd be philosophy and religious studies. Those are very human things to do. History. You study the history of humans. When you study other kinds of history, say geology, you call it natural history. But when you go into a history class, it's not surprising that it's not the history of trees. You expect it to be the history of humans, right? Not natural history. English or literature. It took a while for English literature to be taught in colleges, and one reason was it was assumed you'd be reading your own literature. You don't need to go to college to be taught English literature. You'll be reading that anyway. You have to go to be taught other literature. You should be reading Shakespeare and Chaucer anyway. Hemingway, too. American literature. So these are the things humans do. I suppose in one way you can even add in things like accounting. There are classes called philosophy of, and you can pretty well put anything after that. Philosophy of business. How do humans do this? Ants accumulate things. Are ants the same as humans in business, or are they different? What is it that humans do in law? Philosophy of law. So you're studying especially the humanities, what they do, and we're going to see it's especially something called the moral law, as opposed to the natural law. The sciences are going to be looking at the natural law. And it's many aspects. You can look at that in physics, the natural laws of physics. You can look at the laws in biology. Right? You can look at the laws in chemistry. But in the humanities, we're looking at what laws govern human actions. What things can we learn from human actions and human choices? I mentioned the idea of the good at the beginning. How do human choices work out, say, when they do choose to pursue what is good, or when they don't? What will the consequences be like? That's what you look at in history. There's usually a couple big things you study in history, and you have to memorize the dates. What are they? Usually wars, right? Yeah. Yeah, you memorize dates. And if dates in history come to mind, it's almost always wars of some kind, right? Or the birth of generals who went on to fight wars, right? Choices and human actions, especially when human civilizations interact and have conflicts. And you study how those turn out, what the conflicts are. And those are usually the dates you have to think about in human history. How does this, what laws are there that govern human life? So I'm going to call that the moral law. Let's say the moral law is law-like in the following way. Because when you think of law, you probably don't think about, say, a moral law. When you think about the laws of physics, there's not something like free will in physics, right? You drop two objects to see if they're going to fall at the same speed, and they don't have a choice in the matter. They just do what they're going to do. So in what way are there laws governing human choice? Well, there are laws in this way that there are necessary choices that we must make, that we must know about to achieve what is good, and there are inherent consequences in the kinds of choices we make. That's law-like. You can't get around it. You can't choose to, say, neglect what is good and still have lasting happiness, for example. So there's laws that work that way, and as we look into human choices, human history, we see those coming out. That's one reason we study history, but then we also study literature. And literature is nice because you can write about things without having to go through them. Right? So if you want to write about massive wars that devastate Middle Earth, you don't have to actually live through what it would be like to have an orc attack. Right? You can write fictional accounts of these things. So we had some good conversations today in ethics, didn't we, about literature? Portrait of Dorian Gray, Metamorphosis, Richard III, and think about what these different stories illustrate. But insofar as they're illustrations of human life, or something relating to the humanities, they will teach us about some of the same moral law and what is good. So this is getting more into focus what the humanities are, so we can answer the question, why study them? And really what this makes us focus in on, just like I said, the humanities, the humanities. What is it to be a human? Did you ever, have you been asked that question yet? What is to be human? No? Soon. Right after this talk, probably. Are you able to distinguish a human from a non-human? Is it hard? A human from a shaved ape? Let's say you go into a room, you're going to hear a really interesting talk, and it's somewhat full, and you want to make sure you sit next to other humans, not next to a shaved ape. It'd be too bad to get stuck for 90 minutes next to a shaved ape, wouldn't it? How do you know what you're looking for? Do you have to do a DNA test of everyone around you? Yeah.
I want to argue that it can be kind of hard to determine he was human or not human based on what your moral law is. Because there's, like, if you think about the abortion debate, there are people who think an unborn child is a human, and then there are some people who think, no, it's not a human.
Right, good. So that's a good point about some of the most heated debates we've had are about this question of what is a human? Or it might distinguish this, what is a excellent human and what is a human? People might make those distinctions and say you're not doing well enough. And others might say you're simply not a human at all. But even then, I think if we work back from a clear example, we could probably work back and clear up some of those more difficult cases. So that's why I'm giving what I think is a clear example when you come into a room to take a seat. Now, here's one thing. Shaved apes don't usually show up for talks at PVCC. Right?
You haven't gone to all talks?
Yeah. I was going to make a joke about a competing university of mine, but I'm not going to. Right? So what is there about asking the question, what is a human, which answers the question for us? Yeah, David?
Well, of course, classically, one of the things that they used to distinguish humans was what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
Which is language.
Yeah.
And I always remember that one of the legends around Christopher Columbus when he comes back from the New World was that one of the first things humans started asking is about the native people, who they speak.
Yeah.
That's what you want to know first of all.
Yeah.
Because that would determine whether they had to be treated like humans or not.
Right, so I might repeat some questions just for the recording to make sure it's got on there, but Professor Ruby is pointing out that it is especially language as a symbol of thought that distinguishes us from humans. I'm reminded of the movie The Mission, in which a young native boy is brought before the Spanish or Portuguese. They were the Portuguese and the Spanish priest brought him to them and showed that he could talk, and they dismissed it and said even a parrot can talk like that. And it's very easy to distinguish between a parrot and what a human can do. It's not even close, so that's a shameful response. So you say, do they talk? And a parrot can maybe say, I want a cracker. And you say, yes, Polly, but why? Why do you want a cracker? He's stumped. That's as far as he goes. Yeah. Yeah.
But to go back to his example of the time of like Columbus or historically, you can also think of people distinguishing what's human versus non-human by class, gender, race, etc.
Oh yeah, so they might, in other words, do that, artificially draw the lines, and then there are inherent consequences to that. What's interesting is there's not just consequences on others when we draw the lines incorrectly, but on ourselves. So if I say, I'm a human because of something that isn't what makes me a human, I end up misunderstanding my own humanity also, and I have consequences for that. But so you're right, history is filled with some of these problems, and you'd have to get around the point you're bringing up about language and then thought.
Well, because, and I think people sometimes confuse the concept of language with being able to communicate or speak. Because animals definitely speak.
Yeah.
They have speech, but they don't have language, which also implies logic, reason.
Yeah, so you can put it this
Our
way.
means of communication is a means of communication that utilizes the ability to reason.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you might put it this way, communicate as with other humans. Because fax machines communicate, our heart and brain communicate, birds communicate, bees communicate, but it's not as with other humans in the sense of, as I said, a follow-up question about what they're doing. So that self-reflective question, what is a human, is giving us the answer to itself, right? We don't see the shaved apes getting together having discussions about what is it to be a shaved ape. Well, let's get together and we'll read one of our books and try to figure out what the shaved apes are like. You say, well, they don't have opposable thumbs, so they can't write things down. I think if you were in a desperate situation, you would write down like this, right? You'd figure out some way to say, don't eat me, right? You'd find some way of communicating. So what is a human? And Professor Ruby brought up the category which we'll rely on as a quick category, a rational animal. To emphasize two things, that we are embodied, and so we do occupy history and space, but we also are rational. There aren't similar activities going on. Whatever else the birds do quite well, they don't do this. So part of the study of the humanities is part of answering that very question of what makes us humans. What distinguishes humans from non-humans? And what you're getting at with your questions gets precisely to what happens when those lines are drawn incorrectly. And the moral law would teach us about that. What are the consequences of drawing those demarcations incorrectly? And as I was saying, it wouldn't only have to do with the other, it would have to do with yourself. If you think you're a human for some reason, like your economic status, which then you can lose, you lose your own humanity then. And you'll guard that. You won't recognize your own humanity as being grounded in the capacity to understand.
Well, and if I might, this adds another question, because it goes back to the question that Queens asked of Columbus, because you have to look at the analogy of the New World crossing the Atlantic and finding a new world as being analogous to our exploring outer space and finding another planet. Whatever we find another planet, and we're able to communicate as humans do.
Well, here's what happens.
These people from, like, they were able to with the Indians.
Yeah. So the question is about space exploration. If we encounter aliens, and you'll notice in science fiction, they always draw the lines on precisely where we are right now. So reflect on Star Wars. You'll have a big, giant, worm-shaped thing called Jabba the Hutt, and Luke comes in and talks to Jabba the Hutt. But next to Jabba the Hutt is a bowl of frog-looking creatures, which Jabba the Hutt eats. He doesn't chat with them or talk with them. Luke doesn't address any conversations to them. They're just animals. And outside in Tatooine, there's all these pack animals carrying things, and then there's weird-looking creatures you can talk to, right? So the emphasis there is precisely it doesn't matter what the shape is, so to speak.
So being human has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, the shape of it. Well, I don't say nothing to do with the shape, but the look of the shape, but that you are embodied. I suppose one of the things that's in contrast to is an angel, a pure intellect, no body. So this is to say you are embodied, you're in history, you are in space somewhere, geography. So when you study history, you look at time and location, but it's not only that, as it would be with the trees. And in the same with fantasy. So that was science fiction. The same would be true of fantasy. When the hobbits are in this forest and there are these ent creatures, which are trees that can talk, there's a lot of other trees that don't talk, and they are ignored. They're not part of the story. But there's some trees that do talk, and they're part of the story. Right? That's what matters. And that's one reason I always sort of feel bad about the orcs in that story. Because they are shown having conversations, and they're never addressed that way. And they're so industrious, if you've ever seen the movie. Sauron has a great economic plan. There are no out-of-work orcs. Everyone's industrious, everyone's working, right? Whereas you look at a place like where the Rivendell, the elves live, they're all out of work. They're just laying around doing nothing. So you kind of wonder what's going on there. But the point's still the same between the two, right? There are animals you ride on, and then there are other creatures you can talk to. Oops.
If I may.
Yes, please.
What you gentlemen are talking about here is sentience, not necessarily. Sentience equals human. Is sentience plus communication, rationalization?
It's especially
equals human. That's a rather arbitrary definition, isn't it? Isn't that drawing a line?
It's what distinguishes us from non-humans, at least. So I use that word, distinguishes us and our activities, what we do. So in that sense, it wouldn't be arbitrary. To be arbitrary, you could then say include others. Like, we've sort of left the parrots out of voting. We should allow the parrots to start voting. It's arbitrary, they're not in it. Well, we could say this way to show it's not arbitrary. Anyone who can reflect on and think about the arguments involved in politics can be involved. So it's not arbitrary in that sense. Yeah.
So, kind of back to like chicken and the egg argument. What's the difference between Goofy and Pluto?
Now, you have to remind me. These are both in Disney.
Yes.
And in this cartoon, it's like the example I just gave of the Ents, which they look just like trees, but they talk. Right? So in one of these two, they're both dogs, but one talks and one doesn't. Right? And so Pluto, right, he's the dog one, he just gets treated like a pet. But you couldn't have Goofy as a pet. What is it called when you own a human? A slave. Right? And you don't say that about pets, though. I mean, I guess there's some groups that might say, free all the pets. But you'd free them immediately into their own demise in the desert, right? So that's not arbitrary.
But it goes back to his question about sentience.
Yeah, ability to think, to be, let's say, if you can't think, you naturally exclude yourself from the group. It doesn't have to be done arbitrarily. We'd have to say, oh, you have glasses on top of your head, sorry, go out of the room. That's arbitrary. But if you're just not a thinking thing, you're not, like the table is just naturally excludes itself from being in the group. It does not participating, right? The parrot.
So self-awareness doesn't automatically equal ability to reason.
Oh, no.
And so
No, we have cameras in my room, my rooms at ASU that turn on, they're aware if you're in the room or not. And they'll turn on and monitor you, and Big Brother will be watching. I don't know if this has happened to you, it's pretty creepy, but I'll talk about how I should buy something. Oh, I want to get a hedge trimmer. I've been looking into hedge trimmers. I want just the right one for my shrubbery at home. And then in an unrelated time later in the day, I'll be looking on my cell phone, and there's an ad for hedge trimmers for the kinds of shrubbery I have in my home. I didn't look it up at all. Isn't that creepy?
That is creepy.
Yeah, and I've been asking students, and they say the same thing. They say, oh yeah, that happens all the time. So in some sense, the cell phone's aware of what's around it. So when you add in self-aware, that's an important piece, right? Self-aware in that the humans are asking this question. And that's why it's not arbitrary. It's not as if there are parrot libraries that we're ignoring. You'd have to ignore all kinds of examples of writing in the New World to say they're not thinking, right? Pictographic writing, for example.
Math.
Oral writing, math. So you have to ignore all those things. So it's not like there's a whole bunch of libraries by the shaved apes that we're just going to turn a blind eye to. They're not doing those things. Now let's look at this is all setting up what is the humanities. I haven't yet told you why to study them. You might still decide not to. In fact, in number 3, the whole point of number 3 is to dissuade you from it by looking at how there aren't very good arguments about it. I did a study this summer on all of the arguments, and this is kind of a catalog of them, and I don't think any of them is very strong. I want to see if I can get $50,000 out of you with any of these arguments. Does that sound good?
I'm a humanities teacher, I don't have money.
Yeah. That's roughly, like, say, a 4-year degree, roughly 50 grand. And so if I can get that out of you, I'm going to go into sales, right? So, for example, some of these somewhat blur into each other. They're somewhat similar. They overlap, the first two, for example, but somewhat different. The market value argument. And I'll see this when I visit other schools, and I'll end up in their philosophy departments, and almost inevitably they have a sign up that says, what can I do with a BA in philosophy? And it will list a bunch of jobs you can get. And they'll reassure you that employers are just desperate for BAs in philosophy. They're just climbing over each other to get at you, according to these signs. And they would much rather you have a BA in philosophy than let's say, some investment company would so much prefer you to have a BA in philosophy than a BA in accounting or finance, because it shows you can think, according to these signs. And that's what they're desperate for. They don't want people coming out with degrees in finance. What do you think? How's that interview going to go? Can you budget a book? No, but I can think about Portrait of Dorian Gray. So the market value argument, that may or may not be true, but what ends up happening, because I've seen research that shows it may be true. I'm not putting that down and saying it's not true. But on the other hand, it may not always be true. It might depend on certain other market standards. And it reduces what you're doing in humanities to just another trade. Humanities teaches you a trade, like many other things. It's one of the trades. And we distinguish between a college and university and a trade school, right? And those aren't like a value judgment that one's better than the other. It might be that successful people go to trade school, and the others, like Anderson, go to philosophy. The unemployment line is no longer just for philosophers, they say during a recession. So at a trade school, you learn some useful skill that you can say, I did this, right? I built that. I organized that. So a market value argument turns the humanities into that. Philosophy will somehow be one of those and takes away any sort of intrinsic value to doing the humanities. And the utility argument's like that too. Not only in terms of a job, but that somehow humanities helps society. We need people doing the plays of Shakespeare out there. And so we have to fund PVCC or ASU to have humanities degrees to teach people how to perform Shakespeare for a community. So it has some utility for the community. It's not just for your job, but there's some value. Because wouldn't that be sad if the arts and humanities go together, disappeared? There's no one out there to lead discussions on Richard III. Wouldn't that be sad? So we have to have public funding at $50,000 a year to teach people how to bring these things to their community. So once again, you can see that's the same problem, right? It reduces the humanities to some tangible asset, and they can be developed in other ways. It doesn't follow universities can't feel secure in that argument, because if people value something, then they would pay for it. So you can have groups get together, and you could do one of these online fundraising things and fundraise to have a local Shakespearean company and pay for them that way. It doesn't clearly connect that you have to have massive expenditures through universities to provide this outcome for the community. It could be a hobby that people do, right, without much of expense. How about this? By studying the humanities, you lead a better and happier life. This is trying to get closer to an intrinsic value argument. It's not just that you'll get a good job and have an income and a retirement package and be able to enjoy yourself, but that you lead a better and happier life. What does this mean? And is it incredibly snobby? By studying the humanities, you're living a better life than other people? This is one of the things that the academics get known for, is thinking too highly of themselves. Looking down, that's why they're in their ivory tower, looking down at the ants down there. Oh, they only know how to build impressive buildings and take care of health and balance the books. They don't know how to fill in the blank with something from the humanities. I read this argument from a philosophy and literature professor named Stanley Fish. And he said, anybody who gives this argument hasn't spent any time around philosophy and English faculty members, who are some of the most miserable people. So he's himself in both of those. He's not taking a shot at some other job, right? But if this was true, then you'd expect the happiest people to be the philosophy faculties who argue bitterly and can't agree on even the smallest things. So just by observing that, you see, I guess that isn't true. And that's if you've gone on to advanced degrees, you don't have those things. How will you convince someone to do a lower level degree? You don't have those things. Well, we need philosophy to have better citizens. Because I was mentioning earlier, you're voting, you'll have different arguments presented to you. And so you need something like philosophy or the humanities, the humanities, literature to be able to think outside yourself and think about other people's life experiences, history, in order to be a better citizen and vote. Yeah. Do you have a question?
It wasn't a question so much is that all of these look like excellent arguments, to some degree or another, but you used a phrase there, I think it was appreciation for perspective. All of these are great, but they gloss over the point of the humanities, don't they? In that it imparts a richness and a fullness where it's not what to think, it's how to think, and appreciation for thinking, and ability to shift gears of perspective.
Right, so the comment is about, so far, all of these are missing the essence of the humanities, right? And I think that's part of it. They're reducing the humanities to some other practical outcome.
Which I believe is the point you're trying to make.
Yeah.
I wanted to stab on that point.
You're right.
Appreciation for perspective.
Yeah. Right, and I think they're outcome-driven examples, which is also difficult to map onto the humanities. Quantitative and outcome-driven. You can measure how many people got jobs with your degree. You can measure that, right? This one's a little harder. How do you measure how many of your students had a better and happier life? But I suppose you could still do a poll of some kind, call them up, hey, did you have a better and happier life by having studied with me? And somehow quantify that. Better citizens. This has, again, that same sort of ivory tower smugness to it, because it implies that the people who best know how to vote are those in the humanities or in the academy, and they'll tell the rest of you how you should think about politics. They're the technicians, so to speak, who have figured it out. And have you ever come across that kind of attitude, or at least got that impression that professors think that way about politics? Even when their field, very rarely is their field political science, but there is political science, and among political scientists there's great disagreement. But most of the professors we're talking about aren't political scientists. And yet because they've studied other things, their view is thought to count as more than others. And if that's the case, then really why not just hand the democracy over to them? Okay. Yeah. Why keep everyone voting? It's one of the reasons that Thomas Paine wrote a book. Do you know his best known book? Common Sense, which was against elitism like this. The kinds of things we're wrestling with are things that everybody can know about. And I think there's something to that, especially in the concept we're dealing with the good. This is not something for elites in universities, but something all humans can know in virtue of being a human. So again, this is not something you see borne out any more than this one and the comment about being around English and philosophy faculty. Someone might say, look, in one way the humanities are getting a big boost by technology. There are web pages that have all of the classics. MIT has a classics page, all the Greek classics in English. And so they might say there's going to be this new wave of humanities because of all the access we have to these books. Bartleby.com is another one. I haven't figured out that name yet, since he'd prefer not to. Why would you name a web page after him? But, and then there's Gutenberg.com. I mean, some of these have just every book you can want from the humanities in English. And some of them are like a text, but some of them are pictures of books you wouldn't even get to see in museums, very rare. But again, perhaps this is like the comment you made before, you lose some of the essence of the humanities here. Can AI do humanities? It can search these texts in the blink of an eye. You could ask the MIT site to search for the word or the phrase "the good" in all of Plato, and it responds within 1/10 of a second, which would take you a career. And so you think, wow, this is great. We don't really even need humanities anymore, is one way to go. Or you could say the other way, this provides you with so many tools you can now use. You might be poor because you're so rich. And you're not even seeing the value of these anymore. It doesn't take away the need for that human element. And so if you haven't fostered that human element, you could have every book available and it wouldn't matter. And then there is the intrinsic value argument, which might be the one we're most tempted to. But remember, we're asking the question, why study the humanities and in what context? Because as I said before, someone could say, you should study the humanities, and that's why we provided you with public libraries. We don't also need to fund your four-year degree. You're not making use of the libraries we gave you. So the intrinsic value argument could be one that says, rush out to your local library. Get a library card and start reading. Ask them to start populating their shelves with great humanities books. Have to move over. I'm not going to name any ones because I'll name your favorite popular literature. I'll say, hey, wait, why is that one moving over? They have a lot of computers usually in the library, so you can look up bartleby.com, and they're being used for Fortnite. Right? So what is the intrinsic value of the humanities? We don't want to just let that go and say, oh, it has an intrinsic value, because sometimes what people mean by that is a kind of direct apprehension of beauty. You read some work, and you feel this overwhelming sensation of beauty, of the sublime. Have you had that? I'm not saying it isn't there, but is that what this means, the intrinsic value? If you haven't had that, you should try for that, to connect with some great piece of art in literature or philosophy or any other area, and you just say, wow, that connects to something. But is that what it is, this kind of experience? I want to say it's more than that. It is an understanding about the nature of things. And when you think that's what comes through, you might have that experience, but the experience itself, the direct apprehension, doesn't replace this other. Sometimes that's called contemplation, a withdrawal from things. And you might try to get that immediate sense of the sublime in many different ways. So the intrinsic value argument does come close if we correctly identify what the intrinsic value is, but it hasn't yet told us why to study the humanities. Now, two more that we see, because they hit on the two sides of the political spectrum. There's a conservative argument for why study humanities. Not political narrowly in the voting sense, but in the sense of the word conserve. To conserve the best of civilization. Those works of art or literature or philosophy, we don't want to lose those, nor do we want to keep them around and they're misunderstood or not thought about. So you want to conserve them and build on that wealth of nations. See it as your inheritance. Not lose it. That's the great books, for example. That you get to be familiar with that. For a relatively cheap amount, really for free because of the websites I mentioned, but otherwise quite cheaply, you could have the great books in your home. And I'm not narrowing that down to some specific list, like it could be quite broad. I remember being at the library at Oxford on the tour, one of the oldest English libraries, and they have, the books are all chained. And you have to check them out. You can't leave with them. You sit there and you look at them while you're there. But they're so valuable, even when they were originally made, not only as museum pieces, but the care and time it took to make one in the first place. They're chained to the wall. And now you think of books relatively free, right? Maybe a quarter at Goodwill. And you complain about paying that. A quarter, when's half price day? So you want to conserve the best of civilization, but then there's a liberal, again, not necessarily voting, but because of the use of the word, to liberate from injustice and ignorance. This is why this word is in the phrase, the liberal arts and sciences. It's for two reasons. And because of that word and the two meanings it has, it actually unites this point and this point. Because it could be a reference to a book. And a liberal arts education is a book education, where you learn of the best ideas so far. That's what you do in a liberal arts education. Or it could be a freedom education. Yeah. Where you are freed from, especially the shackles of ignorance. Do you want to be freed from that? Say, no, I kind of like it. It's cozy. Ignorance is warm and cozy. And that is a hint at one of the things we're looking for in the humanities. If you're freed from ignorance, the implication is you're not ignorant, which is a double negative, which means you know some things. And that's getting us to the intrinsic value of the humanities, and it also unites these two. What are the things you know about? All right, now that brings us to this fourth one. All right, having considered those, I don't know that any of those was a knockdown argument to explain why you should take out $50,000 of student debt to study a humanities degree. Did you think any of them was? I mean, if someone came to you and said, I'll pay for you to do it, you'd, sure, why not, right? Kind of a nice life, no heavy lifting. Especially now they have Kindle on your phone. You don't have to carry on books anymore. Have 100 books with you, not have to lift anything. But otherwise, why would you want to do that? If you could, in contrast to say you go into nursing, and even if you do have to take out that kind of debt, you know the kind of income you'll be making very quickly and how quickly you'll pay it off. So that gets back to that first one. You have to have some promise that, no, you'll be able to pay this off eventually. So we're going to look now at this next point to see if we can narrow this down. Yeah, hand up over here. How have skepticism and fideism affected the humanities? So skepticism is the claim that no knowledge is possible. It's all a matter of opinion. It's all perspective. And fideism, and it's like they share that. They would both say that. Fideism says the same thing, but they disagree about what to do about it. The skeptic says, therefore, don't believe anything. You try to live in this state of recognizing it's all a matter of opinion, there are only beliefs. I have my beliefs and you have your beliefs. And the fideist agreeing with that, knowledge is not possible, but you have to believe something. You might have to take a leap of faith into something. And what happens when these have affected the humanities? That might be a unique trait of the times, the last number of decades that we live in a way it wasn't before. And that might be one thing that you find out when you study history is the humanities weren't always affected by that. But they are now. What would the implication be? You imagine, say, in a trade school, you'll learn some skill, some useful skill. But imagine if you were told on day one, no knowledge of any skill is possible. And at the end of your time here, you won't have knowledge. Would you want to pay for that? You'll spend a lot of time reading various things and you'll have only opinions at the end. My opinions, other people's opinions, your opinions, and that's all you'll have. Does that sound enjoyable? Or worth that money? You might say, I'm going to do that, but I don't want to spend 50 grand on that, do you? And it could happen, this might, for example, represent a secular context, the kind of school I'm at, St. Beelzebub's. But it also affects the university. You might go to St. Mary's, and it affects it there also. It can't be a St. Luther, can you? There is Luther College, but you want to say St. Luther, do you? So a religious school or a secular school could be both affected by this kind of what is called philosophical skepticism. So both of these say the same thing. No knowledge is possible, or nothing is clear to reason. Nothing is clear. So we should ask this question, well, why should I study anything if this is the case? Yeah.
Because it's about the journey isn't it? I mean, knowledge is not possible. Well, you know, that may or may not be the case, but like taking that trip, it's got to be worth it, right? That was weak, sorry.
No, that is a common answer. The journey is worth it, or the experience of it. But what is worth it about the experience?
Because it sparks the imagination. It drives the mental faculty.
Yes, to do what though? Because there's something I'm looking for that people will say about the experience. Yes?
To keep learning, to keep growing in knowledge.
Learning is what they'll say. They'll say some version of, I'm so glad I know these things now. That made it worth it.
Yeah, but we don't learn in a vacuum. We learn because we want to be able to relate.
Sure, that's fine too. That's why I said up here, all the many aspects of human nature and its relations. Absolutely. It's not like you get a library book and go in the corner and nothing else. You're learning in that. Even if you're reading literature and fiction, you're doing that, let alone history, let alone then relating to others in your life at this time. So yeah, definitely it's all aspects. It's not solitary. I think that's what would happen if you took it in the intrinsic value mode or the contemplation mode. That would lend itself more towards what we might call a monastic ideal, where you could just be pursuing a personal, direct vision of the sublime. And then you get rid of that whole journey that you're mentioning. Yeah.
But it goes back to the whole thing. It's sort of like to say, oh, well, knowledge is impossible and nothing is for a reason, but we need to study anyway. What's the point? The studying's not going to lead to knowledge.
Yeah.
It's going to lead to nothingness.
Right. And there's a myth about
that. And then you have that experience, and you do all that, and then you die, and you are nothing.
Yeah. It all amounts to nothing.
All added up to nothing.
Yeah. And then there's one more step though, because I'll go down that road as well. But then they'll say, but you touched others while you were here. And so then you have to thread, and they all die, right?
And what they've done is nothing because they can't know that you were touched.
Yeah.
There's no knowledge possible.
Yeah.
There's nothing possible. This is nihilism.
Yeah, precisely. Thank you. It does lead to nihilism, the loss of all meaning. And if there is no meaning, and the point of a humanities study is to uncover the meaning, then this would be the exact contradiction of a humanities study, right? And so if you're living in a culture which generally has absorbed nihilism in one way or another, it would be very hard to make a good case against this, or against nihilism, or for studying the humanities. And it would be hard to make a case to get people to pay for it, right? And it would be hard to make a case that there's something valuable in it. And what if the humanities professors are the ones teaching nihilism? Then what? Now, I doubt they're sitting down and telling the students, be a nihilist. That's not what they're doing. But they're saying things that by implication would lead to nihilism.
Well, isn't that
Skepticism.
Nietzsche on modern thought?
Yeah, there was a talk about that I can plug. Yeah. Dr. Burton just gave a talk about that and posted a video on the influence of Nietzsche on modern thought and nihilism. And there's ways that that's a part of the study of the modern or the postmodern is studying the ways that different persons have tried to come to terms with that. So for example, Camus in his Myth of Sisyphus kind of talks about, describes things the way you were, right? You're just doing something over and over, some repetitive act, and it amounts to nothing. And so he might try to find meaning in the world through the experience of the sublime, beauty. Somehow that makes it better.
But there's no meaning because you can't know it.
Yeah, that'd be the problem. So what we're distinguishing between a kind of awareness and knowledge. Those are different, right?
Like the camera you said is aware.
Yeah, you could have a kind of animal awareness. And humans aren't usually satisfied with that, or if they are for a little bit, they won't be very long. They want to be able to reflect on and find meaning in things. And just being generally aware does not give you that meaning. So why should we study anything if this is the case? The word this referring to knowledge is not possible, or nothing is clear, or nihilism. And so I'm going to suggest that the opposite must be true then, that some things must be clear, and this helps us begin to articulate some common ground for studying the humanities and really for discussing things at all together. We have common ground in our commitment. All these have come up in one way or the other, some of them explicitly, some of them by implication. So, for example, common ground in our commitment to reason as what makes us human. Wouldn't that be nice to secure that in the beginning of a conversation or a class? It could be part of your dating profile as you're swiping. This person say, I'm not committed to reason. Oh, that's nice. Keep going. I am committed to reason. Oh, good. Be interested to see what comes next. If you're not committed to reason, how far can we get in conversation? What will the outcome be like? And how about commitment to integrity, a concern for consistency? Would you like that to be agreed to in the beginning? So, for example, the implications Professor Ruby was bringing out of nihilism. Someone, if they have integrity and they do assert nihilism, they'd say, and I'll live according to those implications. I'll accept the consequences. And that would be true as well as if someone says, I abandon reason, accept the consequences of that. Have integrity. And third, rational presuppositionalism. This is a sort of a bigger phrase you might say, but I think you can see what it means quickly. Committed to the role that our presuppositions play. That I asked at the beginning of the talk that not all things are equally valuable. Some things are more valuable than others. There's an order to things. And that's true for our beliefs also. We have some beliefs that are more complex, you might call them, not very basic. Think about how our classes are structured that way, right? When you take calculus, you take that after arithmetic. If you haven't done well in arithmetic, you don't just say, well, I'll skip to calculus, I'll do fine. This is to say there is a presuppositional order to thinking about things. We have to get the basic things in place first, and we get those basic things in place by reason. Rational presuppositionalism. And you can then analyze disagreements, which is one of the main things you study in history, disagreements between people, or law. And you can look at them and see where is the more basic disagreement. They might disagree about a line on a map. That's up here, that's not real basic. But you can push it back to more basic disagreements, get to the most basic disagreement, and see if you can resolve that one. And if you're committed to that process or not. And so what if someone says, knowledge is not possible? Say a professor begins a class assuming that. Are they able to identify their own assumptions that led to that? Perhaps they've been committed to experience instead of reason. And that's led to skepticism. Or intuition instead of reason. Yeah.
Can't you argue that knowledge is also biased, though? Because if you look at, say, a war, how it's presented and how it's taught is based on the perception or the bias of the person who actually, or the team that won the war versus the team that lost the war, or the side that lost the war.
Yeah. Can knowledge be biased based on who writes the history books? And what we might point out then is that it isn't knowledge. It's still opinions. You haven't yet got to knowledge if you're operating like that. And what happens then is you get these false antinomies of people responding to each other. You get one biased view, and that makes these guys mad, so they write their biased view, and that makes them even madder, so they write an even more biased view, and no one has yet got to knowledge. And one reason is they're not thinking presuppositionally. So commit to that process. And then committed to the principle of clarity, which was touched on here briefly, but that some things must be clear. If nothing is clear, that includes anything you say or do, which is the nihilism Professor Ruby was talking about. And this would be existentially impossible to live that way. Does anyone actually live that way, that no things have any value? They might get close. The closest I've observed, again, from my observations today at work, is that nothing is of value except for Fortnite. That's the closest they get to, right? But there's still one thing that's of value then, right? But to live as if nothing is of value, there is no meaning.
Well, I think that's what people who suffer from depression have.
Yeah.
They end up killing themselves.
And no one envies that condition, do they?
And it's a horrible, horrible thing.
Absolutely, yeah. So the comment was that that's what people who are suffering from depression are experiencing, and no one envies that. No one says to themselves, I hope when I grow up I'm deeply depressed and can't get out of bed or do any simple tasks. Yeah. We try to cure those conditions, right? And say there is meaning. So the principle of clarity, so we should be able to back up, say in a class, a humanities class, and ask the professor if knowledge is possible, and what basic things are clear. Is anything clear at the basic level? And if it's a humanities professor, they'll love that question. They'll say, oh, this is my favorite. Because it takes a lot of work sometimes to get them to ask any questions, doesn't it? I have to really work just to get a simple question like, when is class over? Right? Yes, a question. What does over mean? Let's discuss this for a while. What is class? Right. So do we have common ground? And if we've lost common ground, have we lost any value in studying the humanities? So then I bring it back to a very practical question after having argued that we can't reduce the humanities to a practical question, but I thought this would be a good self-help pamphlet. What can the humanities do for you? Can you see that as a bestseller? Not quite. There are some sayings that we get in the humanities, and they're so nice that they kind of filter out there, and you'll see them in pop culture. For example, know thyself. Have you heard that one? Now we want to avoid platitudes. Platitudes are nice sounding, but ultimately empty sayings like seek justice. Because everybody says that, right? What matters is, what is justice, right? Or love your neighbor. Well, yeah, everybody says they do that. What is love? So know thyself easily becomes one of those. A kind of empty platitude. And when we've emptied of meaning, we'll see that as the theme of the failure to do the humanities, a loss of meaning. To know thyself would mean to know what it is to be a human. To identify your own humanity. It's not just knowing your favorite preferences. Like, oh, I like pepperoni pizza, and I had some pistachio gelato the other day. Really good. That's now up there. Yeah, together, right? Pistachio gelato on the pepperoni pizza. Knowing my preferences like that is not what it means to know yourself. What does it mean to be a human? What distinguishes you from non-humans? How have you been doing in distinguishing yourself from non-humans? Do you know anything? Do you know basic things? Wouldn't that be nice? To identify yourself that way? And that leads to this next one. The unexamined life is not worth living. Again, these are platitudes you've heard enough where I sometimes am embarrassed to bring them up. Say, yeah, I've heard that. But that's precisely part of the problem. You've heard it and it has lost its meaning. The unexamined life is not worth living, or it's less than human existence. Is another way to put it. The minerals and the vegetables and the animals can lead the unexamined life. Like if you're playing 20 questions, you're trying to narrow it down to something. Is it a mineral? Is it a vegetable? Is it an animal? Right? Minerals grow. They don't duplicate themselves, though. Vegetables grow and duplicate themselves. And animals do those things and move around also. They're animated. And humans have all of those things, but they also can think. They can lead the examined life. They can ask why. Right? And when they don't know, they can get ennui and struggle and suffer. And the depression you're mentioning, right? I don't know. I wish I did know. That would be good. I remember seeing a documentary about Jane Goodall finding what she thought was a chimpanzee dancing in a ritualistic way, which made her think, oh, the chimpanzees have religion of some kind. And I'm looking for, in the documentary, do they ask about why? Do you see a chimpanzee in the corner saying, I just don't get it yet. What is the meaning of life? I'm thinking about this. The unexamined life is not worth living. It's less than human. That's what the humanities are doing. That's what you'd be studying in the humanities. What if you neglected this and you were very good at some of the trades I've mentioned, which I have high esteem for, but you didn't do these other things? Even worse would be you say you're doing humanities, and so you don't know a trade, and your humanities is just empty nihilism. Then you have neither one, right? At least the tradesmen were good at doing something, had a skill. I don't know if you remember that. You had that in one of your classes, but Socrates went to 3 groups, and he spoke most highly of the tradesmen, who could at least do some skill, right? So the unexamined life is now we're living. Would you like to be taught that? How to lead the examined life? This is where I don't know that a public library would be sufficient. You may need a teacher. Now, not yet making a step to you need to pay $50,000 a year to a teacher, but I won't say no. Right? Per student. And then how about the love of wisdom? Do you love wisdom already? This is another platitude where I think if you ask somebody, do you love wisdom? It'd be hard to imagine someone saying no. Unless they think wisdom's some guy who annoys them. Oh, no, I don't like wisdom. Right. But otherwise you say, oh, yeah, I love wisdom. But here's the thing about each of these. You can quickly test to see if somebody does these. This is where the platitude ends and reality begins. You can ask somebody if they know what is clear to reason. If they're even able to articulate that. And then you'll be able to know if they've been leading the examined life, or if they've only been saying they're leading the examined life. Then you'll be able to know if they know themselves. And I'm putting this in a way where you might think I'm talking about examining someone else, but I'm not. I'm primarily talking about examining yourself. Have you been doing these things? Have you yet begun to have a humanities education in knowing what is clear to reason? So while you may say you love wisdom, you should be able to show us that then, right? And in studying the humanities, to study these things is to increase in meaning. The opposite of the nihilism that came up. And to neglect these is to increase in meaninglessness. And one of the things that meaninglessness does is it confuses things that are different. So for example, it calls wisdom, what is actually wisdom, ignorance, and it calls ignorance wisdom. Or it calls good evil and evil good. So it still will use these same terms, but it doesn't know what they are. It mislabels them. It's meaningless. Does anybody object to growing in meaning? Now, if you could have that kind of humanities education, would you want it? I haven't yet answered the question about how to fund it. It would need to be funded if you're having someone teach this to you. So I haven't yet done that, and so therefore I haven't directed you to, say, St. Beelzebub's or somewhere. But I have hopefully encouraged you to...
That was Beelzebub.
Yeah, revenge. I hopefully have shown you the value of it. And what if you could find a teacher like that, or a school like that? Would you want to study there? Study the humanities. Increase in meaning. Now I'd like to see if you have any questions or objections to this. Yes?
I think you should move love wisdom, that platitude, up to where the argument of why professors or people say you should study the humanities. Yeah, because the problem with wisdom is, one, people never follow what sage advice they're given. Yeah. Two, a lot of people do get annoyed by advice from a wise person, right?
That's where it becomes a kind of platitude.
Right, because in society, I have friends who are 60, 70, and they're finding that they're no longer significant. People don't pay attention to them as they used to when they were like younger, 30s, 40s, right? And then also, the problem with wisdom is it's nihilistic. It really has no meaning because it's based on your knowledge, and knowledge, again, is only can have so much of a value if you are really committed to the good.
Yeah, all right, so in other words, we notice very quickly that what someone says is wisdom may not be. And someone might say they're wise and they're not. And all of us can't get away from someone asking you to pay for their advice, right, on YouTube or in a book somewhere. So that someone says they're wise and they aren't shouldn't surprise us either, though. I mentioned just a moment ago what happened to Socrates. And everyone he encountered said they were wise. And upon just a little bit of questioning, he found out that they weren't advised. They thought they knew and they didn't know. And that was the pitiable condition. It'd be much better to not know, but to know you don't know. However, he didn't end there. I've been told so many times by skeptics that he ended there. That Socrates thought this was a good condition, to know you don't know. But that was the beginning of then trying to know things. If he thought that you just ended not knowing anything, that would be a depressing conclusion. It's better than thinking you know and you don't know, but it's not the end. You're then able to start knowing things. And that's why Descartes does a similar thing. Begin by clearing out what you don't know, and then you're ready to start knowing things. Unless we to prevent us from saying somehow Descartes is uniquely modern, instead of doing something that philosophers in general do. But so yeah, you could move that up there as an empty platitude. Seek wisdom.
That, and also, it's hard to say that a fool is not wise. I mean, you can learn things from a fool as easily as you can from a quote-unquote wise person.
Yeah, so a fool, it depends in both cases on what we mean, right? So, for example, in King Lear, the character, the fool, is the wisest one in the play, and that's why it's a kind of literary irony that he's the fool and he's wiser than King Lear. And he tells King Lear, you shouldn't have grown old until you grew wise, and gives him this advice. So it depends what you mean by fool, but if fool just simply means someone who thinks they know when they don't know, then they're not actually wise. So you gave a definition of wisdom a moment ago, which is important, which is you're wise if you know what is good, and you can add, and you know how to achieve or get the good. That's what wisdom means. So then you can begin testing, and you can ask people. You can ask Tony Robbins if he knows what is good and how to get the good, and other lifestyle coaches like that. See if they really know what is good, or how, or not. Because then they may be thinking they're wise and they're really not wise.
Well, I really have to, I'm wondering what you mean by wise and what your definition of wise is. And I also have to say that the statements you've given as examples are presupposing a lot of things. For example, if you say, well, a wise man can say this. Well, how do you know he's a wise man? First of all, we don't know what wisdom is. But people don't follow the advice of wise people.
People
Well,
don't
how do you know
advice,
that the
period.
person who's giving, that's a generalization, first of all, and a gross generalization, because how do you know this person is wise? What example you're giving? And what is wisdom, first of all? And how do you know what this person was saying was wise? Because he's an old person? Or because he's seen as a fool? Those presuppose certain kinds of things, certain conditions about whom you're talking about.
Yeah, what the word means in general. So we throw these words around, and this is why I use this. This is why I ended with this here. We may increase in meaningless. We may have terms that we use which are just empty terms. Love, justice, wisdom come to mind as very important terms to people in our society, but they're thrown around and very empty. They don't mean much. And that's because we've neglected to do these other things. We've neglected to study what is clear to reason. And so instead of increasing in meaning, we've been increasing in meaninglessness, becoming less human.
My favorite statement of meaningless right now that just makes me wonder is when people go around saying, oh, something can come from nothing. That is so patently absurd.
You brought it up, not me, right? Professor Ruby brought up something which we can talk about as an example of something that is clear to reason. Your principle of clarity, or here, clear to reason. You can't get being from non-being. Is there anything more clear than the distinction between being and non-being? Do we ever confuse those? Hey, afterwards, do you mind? Did you bring any non-being? I need some for the parking meter. Do we ever make that mistake?
One of the arguments for non-being, when they say is, well, non-being or nothing is just a state of equilibrium where everything is nullified to zero.
Yeah.
But the minute you start saying that, you're giving characteristics of this non-being, so therefore it's being.
Precisely, yeah. So once you start trying to talk about nothing, it becomes something, and you're no longer talking about non-being.
And you have some very well-educated people who people would think are wise because they have PhD after their name, who are making foolish statements.
And they're spending time on this problem. Professor Ruby's pointing out, people who are well-educated can be spending time on arguing for how being can come from non-being. And if that strikes you as, why are we talking about that? It should. That's ridiculous. And so you may wonder, how did our conversation turn into that? Well, to make this point about if your humanities professor is doing that, is it going to decrease the reputation of humanities? Would anyone want to study something which after many, many years in advanced degrees, you're still not sure about the difference between being and non-being? If that's what it gets you, why would you do it? Like you go into some form of construction, at the end of your 2 years, you don't know the difference between a brick and a non-brick. Here, go build this wall. But what's a non-brick? Get out. You're done. That's not even educated level stuff, right? It's just thinking. So that's an example of something that's clear to reason. I'm glad you brought that up as an example of it. And when I tell people that philosophers, professional philosophers, spend their time on this, people outside of philosophy, they say, then why would anyone want to be a philosopher? You don't know the basic things yet, and you've gone on to teach? So you've increased in meaninglessness to that point, confusing being and non-being, good and evil.
Or saying that A, not A, is A.
Yeah, that's a formal category. Confusing A and non-A. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I've heard many people equate higher education with wisdom.
Yeah.
Higher age with wisdom. More information, the more information you have, then that means you're wiser. Do you think those are common things that you've seen?
Yeah, so I think so. So the question is there an equation in our culture between a degree and being more wise, or having more information and being more wise? And that fits into a couple of these. Like, if you study the humanities, you're a better person or you're a better citizen. So therefore, the more degrees I have in the humanities, the better person I am than you. Or if it's information, then technology wins. You'll never have more information than what they have at the tip of their finger, so to speak, the AI has access to. So you reduce the humanities to an AI. You take the human out of it. But yeah, that happens, and there's no connection. Because degrees are conferred based on doing certain things in classes, you could do those things without yet having done these common ground things I mentioned, right? So you can get a degree, and you can be very proud of yourself and think that you do know more than others. And maybe in one way you have some skills, but another way you don't. And that's a tension in American history that you'll read about as you do American literature. The tension between the educated and the common sense. And we tend to align on the common sense because we say that some things are self-evident. Everybody can know them, not just the elites. And so we tend to come down on that side, and because of that we're called anti-intellectual. And I think that could be true sometimes, but other times it's more like anti-aristocratic. We affirm our common ability to know things, not just the aristocrats. Did you get another hand up?
Can you solve the connection between the good, humanities, wisdom, and meaning?
Sum this up. All right, the question is, can I sum up the connection between the good, humanities, wisdom, and meaning? So the connection was that in the humanities, we're studying human nature. What is it to be a human? The good is that which is according to human nature. What is evil for a thing is what destroys the thing, right? What is good for a thing is what is according to the nature of the thing. So to know what is good for a human, you have to know what is human nature. And to be, therefore, wise, you'd have to know what is human nature, what is good for human nature, and how to achieve that. Wisdom is different than knowledge usually in this way, that it has to do with situations and applications. Concrete applications of how to achieve the good in that situation, as opposed to like what they call book knowledge. And then the fourth piece was extending that to the humanities. Oh, to meaning. To have meaning in a situation or in the study of something requires knowing the nature of a thing. What is that thing? Making these distinctions between A and non-A, or in this case, human and non-human. And when you don't do that, that's the use of reason, right? And when you don't do that, you confuse a human for a non-human, you've lost meaning. You don't know the nature of a human. That's why I used what was intended to be, and it was a silly example of a shaved ape and a human, but to illustrate a very important point. Do we even know what a human is? Do we confuse those things? Have we lost meaning? Does that answer? Is there more? Any follow-up? Yeah.
This is on another topic, but it goes back towards the top on the distinction between moral law and natural law. I think it's really important to distinguish how you have natural law with small letters versus natural law as theory.
Yeah.
Which is, the Roman theory.
Right, yeah.
The Roman Empire. Philosophical thought. Because that seems to be more like law of nature, physical law.
Right, yeah, that could be.
Natural law is, when you look in the terms of, is really dealing with what is the essence of the thing.
Right, yeah.
By its nature, how did the gods, the ancient Romans, how did the gods create something? The thing that it was intended by the gods, and therefore it had a right to its nature, it had a right to its being. And we derive from that a lot of, from that thinking, we derive, so it's a whole school of thought. Natural law is actually a school of thought that's not the same thing as
natural sciences, right. So the point being made is a good one. Clarification about moral law and natural law. Natural law could be a theory of the moral law. Sometimes it's called, some people even have books about the natural moral law. And so that's getting to this idea of human nature and the laws based on human nature.
for the nature of the thing itself, because an animal has its nature that's what's intended to be, that it has its rights and things.
Yeah, so here we're making this distinction on this point, though, in contrast to the sciences. So this is studying nature in that sense. So I know the word nature is ambiguous. It could mean nature in that sense of what science studies, matter and chemicals and biology. It could mean sort of trees and streams. I got to get out to nature. And you don't mean that you're going to go to Newton's laboratory.
I just would like to suggest I would use the laws of nature for that.
Okay, yeah, and then it could mean, as you said, natural law theory. Now, what I hope this has done is the outcome of this is not necessarily meant to be quantifiable, like local humanities majors swell. I don't oppose that outcome. I welcome it, but that's only one sense of the outcome. The outcome, I hope, is understanding about the humanities in studying these things, and especially the love of wisdom, by beginning to know what is clear to reason in order to increase in meaning. And if you leave here thinking, I would like to increase in meaning, I would like to understand those things, then that's a good outcome. And I hope you'll keep in touch with me. If you would like to email me, my email I can tell you quickly, but it's also on ASU's website. If you just go there and you look me up, my name is Owen Anderson, so my email is oanderson@asu.edu. But I'll also stay around here if you want to ask me any more questions afterwards. Thank you for being here.
You're not at Beelzebub University?
Yeah, not at St. Beelzebub's. oanderson@stbeelzebubs.edu.
I have one question before you end. Assume that we're just a bunch of politicians, and you're presenting your case to us because the members of the legislature funding an educational institution, and you're arguing that they shouldn't cut funding for the humanities. In a short summary, because these people are not going to be able to follow you too long and stay awake without being bored, how would you make your argument?
To the politicians?
Why continue funding for the humanities at the college?
Yeah, you have a similar question?
No, I wanted to answer it.
Oh, you want to try to answer?
Yeah.
All right, try. Go on.
You mind? Okay, so some time ago when I was finishing up here at PVCC, I was out looking for a job. And I kept finding these great job adverts, and all of these companies, they were all looking for these great things. They were all looking for adaptability, critical thinking ability, writing and communication ability, self-direction ability, and global knowledge, things like that. Now, you're not going to find that at the GM College of Engineering. You're not going to get that in a trade school or anything like that. It's my contention that the humanities, what all of those arguments glossed over in a sense, is the fuel for the fire that develops these traits, these traits that all of these top employers all are looking for, and by extension what the world needs. And if that's so, then how is it that the fuel for this huge mental fire is so undervalued? And this is where I join you in your question. How is it that it's so undervalued that that it's just been left by the wayside almost? It's been just relegated to almost nothing.
So I think that illustrates what does happen. I mentioned the market value argument, and those are, I said every time you go to a philosophy department, you'll usually see, with this degree you can do the following, and those aren't false. That probably is true, but I also suspect I might be the wrong guy to have an educational institution put forward to the legislator to make that case. I've heard how it's made by my institution, so I would know kind of what they do and what they say, but I would probably be somewhat critical in the following way. If the humanities have not been doing this, are you asking me, which question are you asking me? Get the state to fund humanities who aren't teaching this, or to fund humanities who are teaching this? If the current condition, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, is of a kind of pervasive nihilism where they're not doing this, I couldn't make that case. If instead the condition was where the humanities are teaching what's clear to reason, I think the case makes itself.
Well,
Yeah.
may I add something? There's the problem right there. Because that's what Dr. mentioned, politicians, and I have to say the general public too, are really not interested in wisdom or truth. They're just interested in getting through life. And they're interested in getting through life accumulating as much stuff as possible. They're interested in power. They're interested in their way. So these truths will keep them from doing that, and they're not interested in that.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with people like that, where this is where these arguments have come from, because you have to look at your audience.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. Those aren't good arguments. We study humanities, exactly what you're talking about, to help us become human, be human. But we're dealing with people who don't care.
Okay, so let me just see if I can stop you.
And so I'm being pragmatic here, but just I'm almost done. So I'm being pragmatic here, but these people don't want or don't care about meaning because they define the word in their own.
That's what I was
They are, the only thing that matters to themselves is themselves.
That's what I was going to stop you to raise a question, because much of what you're describing, what's being described is that people in general don't care about, say, wisdom or leading the examined life. They would like to know where their next beer is coming from. And so therefore you have to give them some argument they'll relate to get them into your degree program so you don't go out of existence. But then, to stop you when you said they don't care about meaning, that's, I think, a bridge too far. And that's where we connect with them.
Let's be frank about something. Let's talk about our president. Do you think he cares about meaning?
I have never met him.
Well, listen to what he says. He will say one thing one day and another thing the other day. And it's not about truth. It's not about wisdom. It's not about the examined life. He doesn't examine his life. And many people follow him.
So I'm not disagreeing with the assessment that people aren't leading the examined life. So we have this tension when we think about people. They aren't living the examined life, and yet they want meaning. If all they've ever encountered is the claim that there is no knowledge, there's only opinion, They've never been challenged on that, which is the role of the humanities professor. And so that's why I said in answer to Dr. Redpath, right? His question is, it depends what kind of humanities you're asking me to defend. If you're asking me to defend philosophical skepticism, I couldn't do it. If you're asking me to defend this other, I think it defends itself, right, in the pursuit of meaning. And so then whether it's the common person and the intellectual, both may fail to lead the examined life in different ways. So the things you were mentioning is the common person and not caring, just worried about having fun or something. So how do we press that person? Now I think we need to officially end in one sense, but you can continue to ask me questions because I won't go anywhere. I'm just a philosopher, so I like to answer questions. All right, so feel free to stay and ask more if you do have more. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here.